Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there, hunters. Okay, let's just face it, not quite the Gunner's Guild without guns, so we're gonna kind of sidestep that one for now. Still covering Monster Hunter Stories 2, and I wanted to talk about critical hits today because there's been kind of a lot of mixed info going around. So let's just get into this, and let me explain to you why crits are so goddamn important. It should be no surprise to you if you have any familiarity with RPGs that critical hits hurt, and they're very important. Pretty much any RPG that lets you scale critical hit damage, that's going to be the best thing in the game, and that's what you're focusing on. Because critical hits are typically a global modifier that get applied to the hit after all the other calculations are done, so it just boosts everything. This is kind of true in stories, but it's a little different, so let's just kind of take a look at how we can maximize our crits. First, let's talk about the actual critical hit damage. The base crit damage multiplier is complicated because it's basically a multiplier to your bingo bonuses in the damage formula. It's not just a straight like 1.5 times modifier, which is pretty standard for most games. So it's kind of hard to exactly say what the multiplier is because it's basically double bingo bonus, but then that changes. So the more bingos you have, the better your crits are. But that's basically all it is. It's going to be a fluctuating value. Also, we cannot increase our crit damage. There's no like crit boost skills or anything like that. It's kind of sad, but that's fine. Crits are good enough. Now we're plugging in crits into our damage calculator. We can see that a crit multiplier is in the same category as the bingos and buffs. So the difference between a crit and a non-crit is essentially 20 bingos. Yeah, it's that good. But with this info, we can say that basically every 5% chance to crit is worth a bingo bonus. Alright, so crit chance. Now our base critical chance for our monsties is actually what the stat block shows, which is odd, at least to me. So like a monster with 1 block has only 1% chance to crit with any given attack, and a monstie with 10 blocks is a 10% base crit chance. While that may not sound like much since most monsties are going to hover around the 4 to 5 range, and it may seem like most monsters have pretty much the same crit chance, you got to remember that the crit difference between a 5% crit is getting 1 in 20 hits, and a 10% crit is 1 in 10. I mean, yeah, double, simple math, we got it, we're not retarded. But people underestimate how good that crit chance is. And then tie this back to what we were saying earlier, a monstie with 10% crit versus a monstie with 5% crit is essentially getting a free bingo bonus on average if you consider you've got like your first 2, so it's only 5%. Yeah, you get what I'm saying. Now to further help with crits, we're pretty much always going to put crit XL genes on our monsters, because crit XL is base 12% increased crit chance, which is a flat additive to whatever your monstie's base, and then it's 16% when fully upgraded. Now this alone is a great gene, so think back to what we said about what crits are worth, and this is basically saying this gene alone is going to give you 3 bingo bonuses. Crits are important is basically what I'm getting at. So if we take Stygian Zenogre, for example, who has a base crit rate of 9%, Crit XL brings them up to a 25% base crit chance. That's a lot of power. That's 5 bingo bonuses. Now for non-dragon type monsters, sacrificing a slot for the bingos is going to be worth it regardless, assuming you have attacks that can crit, so sad face for water monsters because like none of their attacks can crit. Now you can use 2 slots on your gene table to get off-color genes and miss out on only 3 bingo bonuses, which is 15% crit, which Crit Eye alone is going to make up for. So basically you're nading yourself a free gene slot, which is why it's so good and why you should always put it on as long as you're building crit monsters.
In this gene selection for our meta monstie builds, we're also going to be running Heroics a lot, which requires you to stay under 50% HP to get big boosts in damage. And if you're so inclined, you can also run Vigilance here to get an additional 25% crit chance when under 50% HP. I mean, if you're going to be in that range already, why not, right? So the only problem with this is that if you're putting this on a non-ice monster, you're going to be missing out on some bingo bonuses, and that damage loss might not be worth it for that extra crit. Well, for ice monsters, consider it, because we already have a free tech slot because we're usually having an AoE anyway, and we can just swap that out and then we're good. Of course, only being active when under 50% HP isn't super reliable and it's not 100% uptime, but that 25% crit chance is mighty powerful.
Now we can also buff our monsters with one of a few buffs that can help their critical rate. The hunter can use the Awakener song from Hunting Horn to increase the damage, defense, and crit rate of the whole party by 15%, which is pretty solid. Though you do need to be careful with it, because the damage buff from Awakener will overwrite Pump Up and other attack boosting buffs if they share the same icon, so make sure this goes first if you're buffing. Monsters can also use Sharpened Blades from Nargacuga, which is essentially the same thing. It's a 15% attack and 15% crit buff for 5 turns. While this buff is actually really nice, I'd rather just get the crit from the Hunter and using the Monstie to buff with Pump Up or Dragon Surge. Now, Dragon Surge is just straight better than Sharpened Blades for dragon monsters. It's 30% dragon damage, 30% defense, and 30% crit rate for 5 turns. It's pretty killer. Even though it's still not as good as Pump Up. Like, it's close, but it's not as good as Pump Up. But for dragon monsties, it gets close while actually giving them their defense up rather than taking it away. It's a pretty fair trade in my book, so it's not a useless skill, it's still definitely good. So let's go back to Stygian with Crit XL and Dragon Surge active. His base crit chance is now 55% for any attack. It's pretty solid. A 50-50 crit is nice damage boost. There's also a few attacks that grant bonus crit innately on this skill for a trade-off of like lower base attack power, which honestly doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things. These moves are probably the best in the game when fully utilized. They are Plasma Pressure for power thunder, Ruinous Strike for speed neutral, Killer Tackle for power neutral, Killer Crush for tech neutral if you need the coverage, and then Hellblade's new attack, which is also for power fire. Neutral monsters definitely want Pump Up and Crit XL, so we're going to be using most of these neutral skills that increase their base crit. Because with, Crit XL and then these base crits and the monster crit, we're going to be getting around 36 plus whatever the crit rate of a monster is. And you also can throw Awakener on them to give them around the 51-60% crit ranges. And then Stygian could technically get like 85 if you put Ruinous Strike with Dragon Surge up. But since Dragon Surge isn't really helping the neutral damage, nor is it getting neutral bingos, it's kind of a waste to try and scale it that way. I put it on a Stygian pretty much only because there's no dragon speed attack and it needs the coverage, so it seems like a decent option. But the damage isn't really there to justify it. But I mean, speed coverage is speed coverage.
There are only a few ways to buff your monsties damage as well, because most buffs actually don't stack, and critical hits just tend to be the biggest multiplier. I mean, no surprise to anyone, right? So it's something that really needs to be taken advantage of if you really want to min-max your damage.
Now lastly, if you're going to be considering co-op or PvP, you may want to try using Popo or Aptonoth because their kinship skills will knock over the targets and let you crit them the next turn, which is crazy strong. Knockdowns are the reason why you need your attacks to be able to crit, because it's a guaranteed crit, so you need to be able to take advantage of that. So to summarize, crits are hugely important for scaling your damage. You pretty much always want to have moves that can crit. Sadly, there are a ton of moves that can't crit, which are basically any of the beam or fireball attacks and most AoEs besides, a few neutral ones and a couple other ones here and there. This is also why we shifted over a lot of the skills on our monsties to be ones that can crit despite having lower attack power. Top end scaling is basically just crits and pump up buff from Joe that I mentioned in my previous video. And I'll include a link to an Imgur album that has a list of all our cookie cutter setups for pretty much all our elements. So yeah, that's basically all for me. Thank you all for watching and good luck out there, hunters.